Thank you very much. Okay, so my title, apologies for the really long title, is broad, dare I say, but it refers to my research interest in print cultures and more specifically on the role of periodicals. And this includes ephemera, manifestos and declarations, pamphlets and fanzines, and as sides of researching the cultural history of the Cold War. So if I show you some examples here, periodicals are an excellent source for historical analysis. They are little archives, and that's a quote for a periodical scholar, as they can provide us with a mode for compiling, mixing, and negotiating knowledges from different places, people, and sources. Periodicals have been discussed in scholarship as institutions and as agents of cultural fields, with the ability to intersect and, amongst others, affect these literary fields or cultural policies. I view periodicals as visual and material objects that are not only products, but also producers of the reality from which they emerge. And I think it's quite important to share this aspect of my methodology, if you like, or my approach to periodical studies in this presentation. So periodicals are integral parts of the realities we inhabit. As the postcolonial scholar Arjun Appadurai has famously claimed, in regard to the circulation of objects, periodicals as objects are things in motion that illuminate their human and social context. If we take the study of periodicals seriously, concerning the conditions of production, distribution, and readership, we can access several layers of encounters, enfoldings, and entanglements that can shed new light and new thinking into subjectivities, experiences, and realities, and especially all of this in light of the cultural Cold War. After all, periodicals as printed matters, they were easy to transport during the Cold War, easy to copy, easy to share, held and passed around, read by more than the subscriber or the person who actually went and bought the magazine or a brochure or a periodical in general, and often travel alongside, or often instead of, the periodicals could travel instead of the bodies who could only imagine their movements through the printed page. As such, the study of Cold War periodicals is very much the study of the era in its complex articulations. This is particularly pertinent when it comes to understanding the different Cold War cultures in what it has largely been considered as a bipolar era. But further than that, by studying periodicals, we can attend to new nuances and give voices to transnational and transatlantic exchanges, reuses, crossovers of material and knowledges. In other words, we can begin to decenter Cold War cultural narratives, look outside national frameworks, and that's quite important in the broader, not necessarily this presentation, but a broader approach to the subject, or on the side of dominant official power structures. So as I said, this is kind of shortly introducing my approach because of that broad title. But what I will do today is I will show you a very specific case study that we can discuss in relation to periodicals in the Cold War. So this is an illustrated magazine as a case study of what I've been discussing. And in what I will follow, I will contextualize the production and distribution of the illustrated magazine and analyze some of the ways that it constructed, performed, and reclaimed a notion of national belonging for its readership. What I want to demonstrate and argue here is that the study of print, visuality, and materiality is an important side of everyday political and aesthetic relations. So here we see a selection of front and back covers of Pyrsos illustrated magazines. Most of you will know that Pyrsos in Greek, in English translate as torch. Pyrsos was published every 2 months from 1961 to 1968 in Dresden of the German Democratic Republic, that from now on I will refer to as East Germany. As it is evident, the magazine was printed in full color, had glossy covers and color images, and was characterized by high quality production values. I actually have some issues of the magazine here, nicely wrapped, quite a few issues actually. I'm very lucky to have an archive, but you can see the size, and if I had it, if I didn't have it covered, you could also see the glossiness of its production. Pyrsos was initiated by the exiled Communist Party of Greece, while its high production values were supplemented by a subsidy that amounted to 25% of its production cost by the International Relations Department that belonged to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in East Germany. So in the turbulent 60s and in the context of the Cultural Cold War, we have Persos magazine published by the synergies of Greek and East German communists. Yet, and as my research in the magazine has shown very clearly, its production values and its complex aesthetics were not typical of the aesthetics and political strategies of neither of the institutional producers. But just a short context of the historical context, really. So we have a map in Greek here showing that the Greek political refugees were granted temporarily political asylum in the Soviet Union and the former People's Republics, except for Yugoslavia, during and in the aftermath of the Greek Civil War, which lasted from 1946 to 1949. And that was following the defeat of the communist-led Democratic Army of Greece. When the refugees, who in the majority were communist or sympathizers, as well as many children, fled the country, the Greek government issued a series of resolutions, confiscated their properties, and stripped them of their citizenship rights, effectively depriving them of the prospect of repatriation, officially until 1982, although unofficially it had happened since the mid to the late 70s. The Greek refugees who arrived in East Germany, many of whom were involved in the magazine that I've just will be discussing today, were extensively actually featured in its pages. They arrived in East Germany as children. They had arrived even before the end of the Civil War and even before the establishment of East Germany in 1948. However, since they had lost the Greek citizenship and were meant to stay in exile temporarily, and until the political condition would allow for their return, their status as political refugees was assigned as Greeks without a home country. So these are some spreads again, showing spreads from the whole corpus of the magazine, showing Greek festivals and articles dedicated to the Greek political refugees. However, Persos' target readership were Greek youth and children. That was very, very clear, and it will come clear actually in my presentation. However, by the time the magazine launched the first issue in 1961, the Greek political refugees had already been living in what was meant to be a temporary exile for 12 years. The youth were increasingly growing distant from a country they had never fought for nor visited, and of course the children had only narratives and stories from family and friends rather than any experience of Greece. Here we see some spreads that refer to migrants, and that's economic migrants, and that's because exceptionally for this kind of publication, Persos was also distributed to individuals and organizations of Greek economic migrants and students in the West. Through subscriptions, the magazine was sent to individuals and libraries and associations, and it went as far as, well, it went to Cyprus, which kind of makes sense, but also Austria, Switzerland, England, Canada, and Australia, pretty much everywhere in the West, apart from the United States, except from the United States of America. The distribution of the magazine across both sides of the Cold War does not only differentiate it from other Greek refugee publications, and it certainly does, but also discloses its editorial strategies and political aims, ultimately to construct a collective national cultural subjectivity for a diverse readership of Greek emigres and beyond, as I will show in the 1960s. And here are, as I said, some spreads from West Germany, Australia, and a very badly designed, but just a very quick snapshot of distribution in 1966, where we have, an idea of how many countries it was going to. I mean, looking closer at this distribution, we can see that there's about 1,152. The magazine circulated about approximately 10,000 copies, so a tenth of its distribution in 1966 went to the West. But also we can see that a bigger number of that strong presence was in Greece, right? For reasons that will become evident soon. So here in Greek, we have the first paragraph of the first issue, of the launch issue, the editorial statement of the magazine in 1961, under the title, "The Reasons We Are Publishing Pyrsos." I'm not going to read the statement, I kind of leave it there for a couple of minutes. But what we find out from the editorial of the magazine is that it has three clearly demarcated editorial strands. To begin with, the magazine endeavored to connect the refugees to Greece, especially the youth who, as I told you, and as it clearly states, had never visited their homeland. For these reasons, the editorial continues, Pyrsos will depict Greece's heritage, and here is a quote of history, its morals and customs, folklore treasures, and democratic traditions, alongside its beautiful landscapes. And that's important because that's what I will mainly discuss today. So here we have some spreads again. I mean, I had them all clearly aligned, but I think it's much more important to see the kind of this wealth of material, which, you know, ranges for photographs and illustrations. And here, in terms of content, because I'm not going to leave it long enough, even for those of you who read Greek to understand, it depicts both the youth in the West and both youth in Greece. And actually, you know, of course, Greek political refugee youth in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The second editorial strand of the magazine is exactly intended to publicize the lives and professional achievements of the young political refugees, as it states, to connect them to the refugees across the refugee land, if you like, as well as to the Greek diaspora in the West. And although it's not clearly stated, the number of issues distributed to Greece, as we have seen, declares that the producers also intend to propagate the achievements of these youth in socialism to the West. Lastly, the magazine claims that it will feature articles on socialist progress. Here, sorry, apologies, these are travelogues, travelogues, traditional costumes, the villages, travelogues from Greece, which is one of the editorial strand, and here I will leave it for a minute. Lastly, the magazine claims that it will feature articles on socialist progress and declare its solidarity with third worldly struggles. Have recently published on this and the ways that it aimed to do this through processes of identification, claiming that Greece in the 60s was also in need of democratization and liberation from foreign interventions such as the US and NATO alliance. Here are, you know, the different, you know, we have crosswords and interior design, fashion, etc. We have articles, novels, and here is what I refer to, kind of the socialist struggle, but also the liberation struggles. So we have articles about the Vietnam War, of course, Cyprus, and liberation struggles in Africa. Pyrsos' seemingly nationalist, patriotic, socialist, and internationalist agenda did not prevent it from, as I just showed you, to publish science, literature, and poetry, features and articles, architecture, interior design, fashion, recipes, and political cartoons, amongst many others, and included a full color 8-page supplement that was, some spreads are here, you can see them here, especially dedicated to children. I don't have time to elaborate on the literary production, and some work has been done on that, very little of the refugees intelligentsia, if you like, during that time. But it's really worth mentioning that Pyrsos published original as well as translations of novels, poetry, interviews, essays, and reports. And here I will mention briefly some of the refugees intelligentsia, such as Dimitris Hadzis, Melpo Axioti, Eli Alexiou, and Apostolos Spilios, were actually writing or reporting, and definitely published in the magazine. Special mention should be given to Dimitris Hadzis, who at some point lived in Berlin and was part of Pyrsos' editorial board. He ran a regular column in Pyrsos, Για αυτούς που γράφουν, where he offered literary criticism to readers, and he also regularly published essays on history, literature, and philology, on topics such as reflections on the myth of the Yenisakritas, on Kostis Palasmas, Yorgos Seferis, as well as essays on Cretan literature, amongst many others. So it's quite an important aspect if I was to, if one is to look into the literary productions of the magazine. But I'm not. I will show you the landscapes. So let me delve into some of the ways that the visuality and materiality of the magazine attempted to construct and perform a belonging to a Greek national body, to a Greek national culture, but conducting a close analysis of landscape depictions in the magazine. What you see here is the whole supplement. I've kind of scanned it all. A 5-year supplement as a special issue in Prisos after 5 years of its publication. And that was a full color supplement with poetry. We can see the landscapes, but also a little poem that is called Patrida, homeland. In Prisos, overall and generally, we encounter countless depictions of Greek landscapes, with the mountains and the Aegean as the most prominent. An extract from a poem by one of Prisos' readers, sent and published in the magazine in 1963, reads, "Oh, my Aegean, I would even burn those poor beloved papers in the cauldron of the steamship that would bring me even momentarily to you." Another letter encountered in the archives asks the magazine to publish more Greek landscapes, as well as more Greek colors in literature and especially poetry. As we read in the readers' responses, and I have quite a few of those actually, to the productions and representations of the magazine, we kind of see an excitement, an excitement of the imagination and a constructed desire to be transported there, to take their place into the Greek landscape. We don't have time to elaborate on broadly the role of landscape representations in forming and performing regional and national identities, as well as, of course, political and class ideologies. Many of you will be aware of the literature and the historical and cultural particularities of the Greek landscape and its depictions, of course, in relation to the idea of belonging to the nation. The Greek topos, constructed and performed, as Stathis Gurgouri says, as a dream of unifying identities, for people of common origins, language, religions, habits, and customs. Of course, initially by foreigners and then adapted from the official ideology of the Greek state. This colonial, according to Yannis Hamilakis, and crypto-colonial, according to Michael Herzfeld, idea of what is the landscape of the nation and its national culture didn't escape the Greek left, definitely not in the 60s. And of course, it's evident here in the discourse of the Greek political refugees who produced and read the magazine. So here we could also discuss, we have these images of the Aegean. And we can also discuss, and I have elaborated on that, on the quintessential Aegean landscape as a cultural production and the legacy, of course, of the Ikoniadou Triada, the 30th generation, in its search for identity, nationality, and escape. But what is the interest to my presentation here is this polyphony of depictions that are not only conceptual, ideological, national, or nationalist even, but visual and articulated materially on the pages and the format of the magazine. Here we see some covers, gives you more of an idea, again, of landscapes, a lot of Greek color, as the reader asked. And here is an example that I would like to briefly show you, which is on the back cover of the 1962 magazine, where we see a postcard printed, and I've kind of circled the front and the back of it on the front and the back cover of the magazine, where we see the materialization of the landscape as a piece of Greece ready to be cut out and sent, possibly to another Greek emigre. What I wanted to highlight here is Prisos' production choices that played a determining role in the way that the magazine was received. The design and materiality of its full color glossy covers that I showed you a minute earlier, and hopefully, there we go, I can show you now. This design, the materiality of its full color glossy covers, often extended the composition to encompass the back cover. I mean, we see it in most of them, actually. It's the exceptions that they're not designed, if you like, as a front and a back cover as one continuous composition. This is not common, and we don't encounter it definitely in Greek magazines or East German magazines at the time. So it's a very it's a particular aesthetic and choice, basically. And we can see that also here, close up, because what we often encounter in the covers of Pirsos, we see the design of the front and the back cover as one unit, a continuous composition, especially when the artwork, as is the case here in the pages, the front and back cover of the 6th issue in 1965, designed by art director Nikos Manousis. One can speculate that Pirsos' editors invited readers to pull out and use these pages of the covers to be displayed in libraries, refugee associations, homes, or Greek language classrooms. Covers, spreads, and postcards are these material mediations that operate cognitively and physically. The landscape materializes on the pages of the magazine. Pirsos operates as a media technology that does not only depict the Aegean landscape, we can see the images, but also employs them as a mode of knowledge production, what Richard Grusin writes as a mode that functions technically, bodily, and materially to generate and modulate individual and collective affective moods or structures of feeling. So in this cover, we see the quintessential Aegean architecture. I don't know if you can recognize it. It's kind of in a modernist, abstracted, if you like, composition by Nikos Manousis. While on the back cover, we see exactly the extension of the color, almost like a mirror of the peace sign to the white of the Aegean landscape on the front. But we also read the lyrics and the notation of the poem Hymn for Peace, Hymnos για την Ειρήνη by Nikiforos Vretakos. So here's the politicization of the landscape by activating the creative energies of the juxtaposition by placing the cover, front cover and back cover. And I'm showing you this example here, but there are countless examples in the spreads of the magazine, inside the magazine. So here we have the Aegean architecture, the plea for peace, and the wish on the front cover. That's quite important. Oh, excuse me. For Happy New Year, Kali Chronia, and Kali Patrida, and happy repatriation. Similarly, the depiction of the Aegean landscape in 1965, again in a modernist abstracted composition, again by Nikos Manousis, while on the back cover we see a comic by Kostas Mitropoulos, possibly a reprint. There have been quite a few of them in Pirsos, referring to the first Greek marathon peace run by Grigoris Labrakis in April 1963, a month before he was assassinated. Here we see a spread of the magazine. I don't have the time to go into it, but on the left-hand side is an interview with Manolis Glezos, famously put the Greek flood in the Acropolis during the Nazi occupation of Greece. And we have a poem on the right by, with the title To Speak Epigenethika and the picture that you see. I'm not doing an analysis of this, just giving you an idea of these different iterations of these juxtapositions that I'm discussing, basically. In other depictions, villages in the Aegean are, as the magazine claims, abandoned by the state. And here we can see the picture, but we don't see in the text in the spread that you are viewing now, or deserted as a result of economic migration, while we also see the criticism of tourist development, according to which the Aegean had become the playground of rich tourists and ship owners like Onassis or Niarchos. And then, of course, there are references to the other Aegean, the site of Exile Island and political prisoners. In this penultimate issue of the magazine in 1967, during the dictatorship of the colonels, a graphic composition of prison bars encloses a text that wishes for a free and democratic Greece in 1968, in the following year. On the back cover, we see a black and white photograph that depicts the vastness and the beauty of the Aegean island, and it's most probably Santorini, although its calmness is disturbed by the images arising from that poem that sits underneath the picture. Written by the communist folklore poet Fotis Agoules, who had been imprisoned and exiled in the 1940s. The poem describes an island that calls him closer, only to remind him of his broken wings. In the second verse, the poet descends into a valley of lilies and lemon flowers, but ends up being chased by dogs and has his heart torn apart. So it's an island that invites but causes pain, illustrates a familiar, albeit dramatic, representation of the repression and sense of exclusion of the Greek left, addressed to those readers who were already familiar with the life of the poets, possibly identified with that tragic life as well. But here is the performance of the Aegean landscape, across the front and back cover of the magazine, with the modernist, very modernist, actually quite radical typography of the time. The prison bars, the photograph of Santorini, the specific poem. The Aegean landscape performs various and often contradictory roles in the magazine. And often, as we see here, at the same time. It stands for the past and the present while it imagines the future. It invites the young readers, who is the target readership of the magazine, to engage with the complex dialectic of the desirable repatriation and the challenges faced ahead. In Greece in the 1960s, we have joy and pain, despair and hope, sunshine and darkness presented across the same plane. And that's what I find is particularly interesting in this magazine. A less design and exciting spread here will move me to my last kind of analysis in this presentation, where I will refer to broadly the mountains. So here in the spread, we see to the right an interview with a group of young Greek political refugees that have just graduated from the University of Dresden. They're all dressed up. The University of Dresden is in East Germany. As we're also involved by the caption, this is, they've just graduated from the university there. We see the flags in the background, and they're happily posing for the camera. The article on the left page, as the picture shows, talks about the student protest in Athens in 1962 and depicts police brutality. This is the following page of the magazine, the following spread of the magazine. So where you see the yellow on the left-hand side is where the interview of the Greek refugees who were posing proudly in the previous spread continues, and they are discussing about their aspirations, of course, about the wishes for repatriation. This is always a constructed narrative. But it's very interesting that, the images that are there that illustrate this interview are of a mountain, and a valley on the right-hand page, quite this beautiful big image, and of a small village road on the left-hand side in the bottom of the page. What is also interesting that instead of a caption to the images, the magazine cites a short verse from a traditional Greek song, from a Δημοτικό, that reads, "Joy to you, high mountains, you always dressed in green, you never age, no matter how many years pass by." Thus, we have the internal mountains that stand for being in place. For Persos' readers who lived and fought in the 1940s in northern Greece, because most of them and most of the refugees were definitely from northern Greece rather than from the Aegean. So that's also another interesting aspect, which I don't have the time to discuss. So these landscapes, especially these mountains that are featured in the magazine, that also depictions of that carry an affective memory. At the same time, they are the landscapes of return, filled with expectations for the future. In Persos' design, however, meaning is produced by this juxtaposition of the landscapes of the poems, the depictions belonging to different temporalities. These are not spelled out, nor discussed, often not even captioned, but rather performed on the pages of the magazine, on the design of the magazine, throughout the turning of the pages and in its materiality. Persos' readers, of course, referring to these two continuous pages, were also confronted with a comparison between the two worlds. On the one, the studious youth in socialism, on the other, suppression and violence on students in Greece. Persos' readers are being educated to read this juxtaposition and derive meaning. For the young refugees, they construct the desire for repatriation because they are faced with or presented with a 1960s reality, but at the same time, there's a continuous construction of a desire to repatriate when that is possible, of course. While for a Western readership, there's a promotion of these bright, young, educated youth who are not allowed to repatriate. So, these different levels that the magazine constructs in its design. The depiction of landscape in Ipsos operated as a visual and a material space for the older generation, a place of lived and often mnemonic experiences, while for the youth, a visual aid and a lesson in topography. However, beyond these past memories and experience is also, as I have just discussed, landscapes that still existed, these mountains that are still there, no matter how many years go by, they're still in Greece in the 1960s. So they are these unchanged landscapes, but they're also the landscapes of return. In the magazine's visual and material elements coexist in a variety of relationships with each other across a page, on a double page spread, as well as throughout the entire issue and the corpus of the magazine on the whole. The juxtaposition of these images and text and the materiality of the magazine are not only merely representations, is what my argument is here, of pre-existing realities, but rather they also produce a reality in the relationships from which they emerge. And also they produce the reality through the reading and the value that they accrue in the different places where they're being read. The process and movements of turning the pages encourage readers to do much more than read text and browse images. As a result of their entanglement in the magazine's visuality and materiality, readers were encouraged to enter, participate in the production of meaning. It is from this visual and material place that the magazine attempted to reclaim the nation from official Greek state discourses, as we have seen here, claim the place for the Greek political refugees or the Greeks without a home country, claim their place in these landscapes, while also propagate the repatriation primarily to the West. At the same time, Peirsos was educating these target readers of the Greek youth and the children to a certain extent, to construct meaning, learning how to read the magazine, learn to recognize through this juxtaposition rather than spelling out ideological or propagated messages. Here the magazine is designed to propagate these messages, to educate them, to identify this intention, and of course, prepare to repatriate. I spoke a little bit fast, but thank you very much for your attention.